In the year 1871, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, a small family existed, shrouded in secrecy and mystery, their existence meticulously hidden from the world. Their story, though brief and marked by tragedy, would forever remain sealed within a dusty government ledger, an archive now buried in history. But why? What was so disturbing about this family that their very existence needed to be erased from the pages of time? And why did the government go to such lengths to classify their bloodline, leaving only cryptic remnants of their lives behind? This is not just a story about an isolated family. It's about a lost chapter of American history, a tale of forgotten people whose lives became entwined with the dark shadows of secrecy, government intervention, and an uncanny fate shaped by the hands of nature itself. In an era when science was only beginning to understand the complexities of genetics, this family would become an accidental case study in the dangers of isolation and inbreeding. Mysterious ailments passed down through generations, each one more bizarre than the last. The Appalachian Mountains, where this family lived, were an unforgiving and rugged landscape. The region's harsh terrain, deep valleys, and dense forests offered a form of protection for its inhabitants. In the mid-19th century, the world outside these mountains was rapidly changing. Railroads connected the cities, and new inventions were starting to make their way through the nation. But in the heart of Appalachia, time seemed to slow down. The land was remote, and its people were often left to their own devices, far removed from the reach of government or modern medicine. It was a place where stories of strange occurrences, hidden families, and secrets festered in the shadows. For the inhabitants of the mountains, survival was often a matter of isolation. Communities formed in small, tight-knit groups where family ties were everything, and the outside world barely intruded. The idea of self-sufficiency was not just a way of life, it was survival. In these isolated communities, traditions and beliefs passed down through generations were often all that defined a family's identity. But with isolation came consequences, some as tragic as they were mysterious. The family in question had lived quietly in the Appalachian foothills for generations, with few outside connections. Over the years, their lineage became an enigma, their existence marked by a disturbing pattern. Those who had the misfortune of crossing paths with them spoke of oddities, strange physical deformities, peculiar mannerisms, and an unsettling atmosphere surrounding the family home. Their isolation was not entirely voluntary. Rumors whispered through the hollows of the mountains, rumors of people who had vanished or retreated into the dense woods, where no one dared follow. And yet, despite their reclusive nature, they were not entirely beyond the reach of the outside world. In 1871, their name appeared in a government ledger, an official record that classified them as a family whose bloodline had been deemed undesirable. What followed was a disturbing investigation into their ancestry, a story that, once uncovered, would raise more questions than answers. The ledger, a seemingly innocuous document, was the key to unlocking this disturbing family's hidden past. But what did it contain? What could have led to the government's decision to hide this family's existence in plain sight? The answers, as we would discover, were as dark and strange as the family themselves. The ledger contained a series of medical reports, scribbled observations, and cryptic notes that seemed more like an experiment than an investigation. These documents, buried deep in a government archive, suggested that the family had been under scrutiny for years. Medical professionals of the time, lacking the knowledge and technology we have today, speculated wildly about the family's condition, but never quite arrived at a definitive answer. Were they the product of generational inbreeding? Did their strange physical traits point to something more sinister? Or was there something even darker hidden within the pages of those records? Some of the notes detailed peculiar deformities that afflicted several generations of the family. These deformities, which could not be explained by modern medicine at the time, only deepened the mystery. Disjointed limbs, unusually pronounced features, and conditions that seemed to defy nature were all described in the reports. But the most chilling part of the ledger wasn't the description of physical ailments. It was the suggestion that the family was being studied, tracked, and perhaps even intentionally isolated to see what would happen to their bloodline over time. The deeper you dig into the history of this family, the more questions arise. Why would the government be interested in them? Why classify their bloodline as undesirable? What exactly was so dangerous about them? The theory of eugenics, still in its infancy at the time, was growing in popularity in certain scientific circles. Was this family part of an early, albeit clandestine, attempt to control the genetic makeup of future generations? Was their isolation part of a larger, more unsettling agenda? Or were they simply the victims of ignorance, overlooked by a government too concerned with its own agenda to offer any real assistance? As we begin to peel back the layers of this mystery, we find ourselves questioning what we know about genetics, heredity, and the long-lasting effects of isolation on human health. In an age before DNA testing, scientists relied on observation and rudimentary tools to understand the human condition. And sometimes, what they saw was enough to label an entire family as abnormal. In this case, their very survival, and their status as a bloodline, was deemed a curiosity, something to be studied, catalogued, and buried in the depths of bureaucracy. But the story doesn't end with the ledger. As the family continued to live in seclusion, rumors swirled. In a land rife with superstition and folklore, the presence of a family so isolated from the outside world only fueled more terrifying stories. Some locals believed the family had made a pact with dark forces, their genetic abnormalities the result of some unseen curse. Others whispered that the family's strange condition was the work of generations of inbreeding, an unfortunate byproduct of their isolation. But no matter how much they were talked about, the family remained a mystery, an enigma that no one truly understood. And so, the questions remain: what really happened to this family? What is the truth behind the government's interest in their bloodline? Why were they erased from history, their name buried in a ledger that no one was supposed to see? In the end, perhaps it's the mystery of their disappearance, the chilling unknowns about their genetic legacy, and the eerie shadow they cast over the surrounding community that will forever keep their story hidden, locked away in time, sealed within a ledger, never to be fully understood. But the more we learn, the more we realize that sometimes the answers we seek are darker, more complex, and far more unsettling than we could have ever imagined. The Appalachian Mountains may have concealed the truth about this family for over a century, but as the pages of history turn, their story remains a reminder that some mysteries are never truly solved. The Appalachian Mountains, with their jagged peaks and sprawling forests, have long been a place of both natural beauty and isolation. The people who called this region home were as rugged and self-sufficient as the land itself, a culture forged through centuries of hardship. From the earliest settlers to those who came later in search of opportunity, the Appalachians became home to families who lived far from the bustling cities and the reach of government oversight. Here, in this wild, untamed land, survival was not just a matter of thriving but of enduring the harshness of the environment and the darkness of isolation. In the mid-1800s, when this family first came to be known, the world beyond the mountains was rapidly changing. New inventions were reshaping society, and industries were booming in the cities. The railroad was cutting through the landscape, linking people and places that had once been separated by miles of untamed wilderness. But the people who lived in the Appalachian Mountains were largely untouched by these changes. For them, life moved at a slower pace, defined more by the rhythms of nature than by the ticking clock of progress. Communities were small, tightly knit, and often secluded from the rest of the world. In many ways, the people of Appalachia were forgotten by the outside world, living as they had for generations, in a world apart. The ruggedness of the land fostered a way of life that was both unique and insular. It wasn't just geography that made the region isolated. It was a culture deeply rooted in self-reliance and tradition. The people who lived here often grew their own food, raised livestock, and built their homes with their own hands. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion, and those who lived in the mountains rarely ventured beyond the confines of their immediate surroundings. The isolation was both physical and cultural, and it bred a sense of independence that was unmatched anywhere else in the country. This was a place where secrets could be kept, where families could remain hidden from the world for generations if they chose to. In the farthest reaches of the Appalachian region, it wasn't just a family's isolation that set them apart, but their strange and troubling history. The family in question, whose bloodline would eventually be classified and erased from the records, lived in a remote corner of this vast wilderness. They were one of many small, insular families in the mountains, but they were different. Their seclusion was not just a matter of choice, it was a survival strategy. There was something about them that made them an anomaly, something about their history and their health that set them apart from others. The more one learned about their past, the clearer it became that they were not just a family living in isolation. They were a family whose genetic makeup had been shaped by generations of inbreeding, a legacy of survival that had far-reaching consequences. Generations of limited contact with the outside world had taken their toll on the family. As time passed, the family became known not just for their isolation but for their peculiarities. They were said to be inbred, their genetic pool so limited that certain physical and mental traits were passed down, creating a family that looked and acted differently from the others. These traits, which could have been easily overlooked in a larger, more interconnected society, became more pronounced in such a tightly knit community. Children born into this family exhibited strange deformities, both physical and mental, that were attributed to the lack of genetic diversity. Some had malformed limbs, others had cognitive issues, and many displayed unusual physical characteristics that were immediately noticeable to anyone who encountered them. The people of the surrounding communities spoke of the family in hushed tones. Some believed that the family's strange appearance and behavior were the result of some supernatural curse, while others thought they were the victims of some unfortunate genetic fate. Whatever the cause, the family's peculiarities made them outcasts, and their existence was largely confined to the shadows of the Appalachian wilderness. They lived in a world of their own, a world where the outside world rarely ventured, and where their name became synonymous with mystery and fear. Despite their isolation, the family was not entirely immune to the outside world. The government, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century, was becoming more interested in the genetics and health of its population. The burgeoning field of eugenics, which aimed to improve the genetic quality of the human race through selective breeding, was gaining traction in scientific circles. While the idea of eugenics was not yet fully developed, early experiments and investigations into human genetics were taking place, often with the goal of identifying and controlling undesirable traits within the population. In this context, the family's strange genetic legacy caught the attention of local authorities and, eventually, federal officials. It wasn't long before the family's name appeared in government records, albeit in a way that would forever obscure their existence. In 1871, their bloodline was classified and marked as undesirable by the authorities, a notation that would remain sealed in the government ledger for decades. Why would the government take such an interest in a small, isolated family in the mountains? Why would their name be marked as a genetic threat? The answer lies in the evolving science of genetics and the government's increasing interest in controlling and regulating the health of its population. At the time, the study of heredity and genetics was in its infancy. Medical science had not yet developed the tools or understanding to explain the inheritance of genetic traits, but doctors and scientists of the era were already beginning to draw connections between inbreeding and certain physical and mental conditions. The family in the Appalachian Mountains, with their strikingly unique genetic traits, became an early case study in this new science. It is likely that government officials, looking to understand and control the spread of certain genetic conditions, turned their attention to this family, marking them as a group of interest in the broader effort to regulate and catalogue the population's genetic health. As the family continued to live in their remote corner of Appalachia, the government's interest in them only deepened. Medical professionals and scientists, some of whom had made the trek into the mountains, began to study the family, noting the unusual physical deformities and mental conditions that affected many of the family members. Their genetic abnormalities, which might have been ignored or overlooked in a more connected society, were now seen as evidence of something more significant. This led to the classification of the family in government records, where their bloodline was sealed away, marked as a genetic anomaly to be studied, understood, and perhaps controlled. In a way, the family's story mirrors the broader story of the Appalachian people, their isolation, their self-sufficiency, and their distance from the rest of the world. It is a story of a region that was often overlooked and neglected, a place where families could live and die without ever being noticed by the outside world. But it is also a story of the darker side of human history, where science, ignorance, and government intervention intersected in ways that left lasting scars on those caught in the middle. The Appalachian Mountains, with their mist-covered peaks and dense forests, continue to hold secrets that may never be fully understood. The family at the center of this story is just one example of the many lost histories that remain hidden in the hills and hollows of the region. Their story, once classified and sealed in a government ledger, is a reminder of the ways in which history can be erased, hidden, and forgotten. Yet, even as time passes, the shadows of the past remain, waiting to be uncovered. And with each discovery, the mysteries of the Appalachian Mountains, and the families who once lived there, continue to unfold, one dark secret at a time. The family at the center of this tale was not just another obscure Appalachian clan, lost in the depths of time. They were something more, something that, despite their isolation, caught the attention of those beyond the mountains. Theirs was a bloodline unlike any other, marked by strange, inexplicable features that made them both an object of curiosity and fear. To the locals, they were more than just a family. They were a haunting presence in the hills, their story told in hushed whispers, their names mentioned only with the faintest tremor of uncertainty. Their origins, like so much of their existence, remain murky. There were no grand tales of heroic ancestors or illustrious family histories. The family's history seemed to have started in the most unremarkable way: simple settlers who had ventured into the Appalachian wilderness seeking a life far from the prying eyes of civilization. But something about their bloodline, something in the very fabric of their being, began to set them apart as generations passed. Perhaps it was the curse of isolation, the limited interaction with the outside world, or the genetic legacy that began to take hold of the family's future. What was clear, however, was that this family was no ordinary group of people. Their unique circumstances, a product of inbreeding over multiple generations, would set them on a path that would intertwine them with the darker corners of history. The isolation of their mountain home was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it allowed them to remain hidden, to live a life that, by all outward appearances, seemed peaceful. But on the other hand, it cut them off from the broader world, a world that was rapidly changing. Without the influence of outsiders, the family was forced to rely on their own resources. Over time, their genetic pool grew smaller and smaller, and the physical and mental effects of inbreeding began to manifest in disturbing ways. What was once a quiet, self-sustained existence slowly morphed into something darker. The first signs of something wrong began to surface as the family grew in number. Children born into this family seemed to be marked by abnormalities that set them apart from their peers. Some were born with physical deformities, limbs that were oddly shaped, features that were disfigured, or skin that appeared unnaturally pale. Others exhibited cognitive issues, displaying strange behaviors, a lack of basic social understanding, and difficulty in communicating with others. These oddities didn't just go unnoticed. They were the subject of whispered conversations among the locals. The family's reputation began to spread, and soon they became known for more than just their secluded way of life. They were a family marked by something deeply unsettling, something that seemed to defy the natural order. The family's physical traits became so distinct that they were immediately identifiable to anyone who had crossed paths with them. Their peculiarities went beyond what could be attributed to mere coincidence. The abnormalities seemed to occur with such regularity that they could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. It was as if the family was a living, breathing manifestation of something gone wrong. Their strange appearance was a symbol of their isolation, a sign that something had gone awry in the genetic makeup of their bloodline. But it wasn't just their outward appearance that set them apart, it was their very way of being. In an area where people prided themselves on being strong, self-sufficient, and resourceful, the family's struggle to fit in was impossible to ignore. They were shunned, avoided, and treated with suspicion. Neighbors steered clear of their house, fearing that their presence might bring a curse or worse. The family, for their part, did not seem to mind the isolation. Perhaps it had become second nature to them, or perhaps they were so entrenched in their strange world that they no longer cared for the judgments of others. They continued to live in their remote cabin, their world growing smaller with each passing generation. As the years went by, they became more of a myth than a reality, more folklore than fact. Despite the family's increasingly peculiar nature, there was an undeniable sense of tragedy in their story. The inbreeding that had plagued them for generations was not a choice, it was simply a consequence of their circumstances. With no one to marry outside of the family, the cycle of isolation continued, and with it, the genetic disorders that came to define their existence. Some of the children were born with deformities so severe that it was almost impossible to ignore them. They were often described as having a strange, unsettling appearance, eyes that were too wide, noses that were too crooked, or hands that seemed to be malformed. These physical anomalies, paired with the mental issues that many of the children exhibited, painted a picture of a family trapped in an endless cycle of genetic decline. The locals, for their part, were not kind to the family. They saw them as a strange and unsettling presence, a reminder of the dangers of isolation and inbreeding. Some even went so far as to suggest that the family was cursed, that their physical and mental abnormalities were a punishment for some forgotten sin. These superstitions only added to the mystery surrounding the family and made them even more of an enigma to those who lived nearby. Yet, despite the rumors and the fear that surrounded them, the family's fate was far from sealed. Their genetic legacy was not just a matter of physical appearance, it was something deeper, something that went beyond the visible. It was a question of survival. The family had somehow managed to endure in the harshest conditions, living off the land and relying on each other to survive. The genetic defects that had plagued them were not enough to break their spirit. They were, in their own way, a testament to the resilience of the human will. But they were also a living reminder of the dangers of living in isolation, a warning to others who might have chosen the same path. Their strange existence had caught the attention of the government, and in 1871, the family's name was recorded in a ledger, a piece of official documentation that would mark them for the rest of history. The ledger, which had been filled with the names of many families, contained a special note next to theirs, undesirable. It was a label that would define them, not just in the eyes of the government but in the eyes of the world. The note signified more than just a genetic anomaly. It was a reflection of the growing interest in eugenics, a field of study that aimed to improve the genetic quality of the human race through selective breeding. In this context, the family's isolated existence, their physical and mental abnormalities, were seen as a problem to be addressed, a danger to the future of society. But for the family, it was just another chapter in their long history of being misunderstood and ostracized. The ledger entry marked a turning point in the family story. It was the moment when they transitioned from being a local curiosity to a scientific subject. They became part of a larger narrative, one in which genetics and heredity would play a central role. The government's interest in the family was not one of compassion or concern for their well-being. It was a cold, detached examination of what went wrong. Their story, like so many others in the history of eugenics, became one of experimentation, a subject of study rather than a tale of human dignity and survival. As the years passed, the family remained hidden in the mountains, their name and their legacy buried in government records, forgotten by all but a few. The ledger, which had classified their bloodline, was sealed away, its contents locked behind the walls of bureaucracy. But the family's story did not end with the stroke of a pen. It lives on in the shadows, in the whispers of the people who knew them, and in the secrets that remain buried in the archives of history. The family's tale is a reminder of the dangers of isolation, of the fragility of the human condition, and of the lengths to which society will go to erase what it cannot understand. It is a story that, though largely forgotten, continues to haunt the mountains where it all began. The ledger, now a dusty, forgotten relic of government bureaucracy, was more than just a record. It was a map of secrecy, a glimpse into a strange and disquieting chapter of history. The family's name had been deliberately placed within it, their bloodline marked as undesirable, their existence tucked into the margins of a larger, far-reaching governmental effort. What appeared to be a simple entry on an official document would later reveal a chilling story, a family whose very existence seemed to challenge the norms of society, whose genetic inheritance became a subject of study and classification. The question, however, remained: why did the government take such an interest in them, and why did they make the decision to classify their bloodline in the first place? In 1871, when the ledger first emerged, there were few government agencies capable of keeping track of the various families, let alone cataloguing their bloodlines. However, the time was ripe for the burgeoning field of eugenics, a pseudoscientific movement that sought to improve the genetic quality of the human population. Driven by a mix of moral, political, and pseudoscientific motivations, eugenicists believed that humanity could be improved by controlling the reproduction of individuals with undesirable traits. These traits, often based on physical appearance or mental health, were considered by eugenic theorists to be inherited and passed down to future generations. In this atmosphere of emerging eugenics, the family's genetic abnormalities became a point of interest. The government's entry in the ledger didn't merely describe their location or occupation. It was an attempt to catalogue the family as a case study in what the authorities saw as a genetic problem. The detailed entries, written in sharp, clinical hand, tracked the family through decades, noting physical deformities, mental health disorders, and other undesirable traits. These records hinted at the government's desire to understand the effects of genetic isolation, as if the family's existence was an experiment in the consequences of inbreeding. The exact nature of the government's intervention remained unclear, but one thing was evident: the family was being viewed as a biological anomaly, a dangerous outlier that threatened the larger fabric of society. The idea that the family's genetics were being tracked and classified reflected the deeply troubling mindset of the time. There was a belief, pervasive in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that certain people were genetically inferior. Their existence, whether due to physical abnormalities, mental health issues, or even behaviors deemed socially unacceptable, was seen as something that needed to be studied, corrected, or, in some cases, erased. As eugenics began to influence policy and public opinion, the family's genetic issues were labeled as problems to be fixed, their future generations considered a threat to the perceived purity of the nation. In retrospect, it seems chilling to think about the mindset that governed these decisions. The classification of the family in the ledger was not an isolated incident. During this period, Countless individuals and families were subjected to similar treatment, their lives and genetic histories marked for study. The government viewed the family not as individuals but as a problem that needed to be addressed. They weren't seen as people with stories, emotions, or lives of their own. They were biological entities, whose value was to be measured by their genetic composition. And, in the case of this family, those measurements were deemed to be dangerous. The scientific community, too, was complicit in the framing of the family's existence. Medical professionals and researchers had visited the family over the years, documenting their physical and mental characteristics. The family's deformities, ranging from joint disfigurements to mental impairments, were the focus of these visits. Doctors, unable to understand the underlying causes, often resorted to speculation. The most common explanation for the family's unusual traits was inbreeding, an unfortunate consequence of a small, isolated community. Inbreeding, they believed, was responsible for the abnormalities, but the exact nature of the genetic defects was never fully explored. Instead, the family became a subject of fascination and fear, a living example of what could happen when genetic isolation went unchecked. The medical records, like the ledger, were fragmented and inconsistent, offering only glimpses into the family's reality. A physician might document a child with a malformed hand or an individual suffering from what today would likely be recognized as a mental health disorder, but the medical language of the time often failed to grasp the complexity of what was truly happening. Some doctors labeled the family's symptoms as degeneracy, an outdated term that now carries an unsettling connotation. The idea of degeneracy was deeply tied to the early eugenics movement, which sought to eliminate traits that were considered undesirable by sterilizing individuals or preventing their reproduction. The family's name was included in these records, though perhaps unwittingly, as a case study in genetic decline. The questions surrounding the ledger entry grow more complex when considering the broader implications of the time. The government, in its early efforts to manage populations, had begun to classify people based on their genetic makeup, often using medical anomalies or social behaviors as justifications for these classifications. The family was not the only one subjected to such scrutiny. Across the nation, particularly in isolated rural areas, small communities lived in isolation, much like this family. These people were often misunderstood and marginalized, their strange traits seen as a reflection of societal decay or genetic inferiority. And in the eyes of some, the only solution to this problem was to segregate, sterilize, or eliminate these genetic strains. The ledger, in many ways, becomes a record not just of the family's unfortunate genetic inheritance, but of a much larger, darker movement that sought to erase what was considered undesirable. The family became a casualty of a time when genetics was still a mystery, and the solution to genetic problems was not yet understood. And yet, in their case, the government's actions seemed to carry an even darker undertone. The classification of their bloodline, their treatment as a problem to be solved, showed how deeply ingrained the eugenicist ideology had become. They were not people to be understood or helped, they were specimens to be controlled. One can only speculate on the motivations behind the ledger's classification. Was it a way of documenting the family's decline for future generations to study? Did the government, or certain individuals within the government, see this family as an example of what could happen if society failed to control genetic flaws? Or was it simply a bureaucratic oversight, an unfortunate entry in a ledger that marked a family's disappearance from history? What is certain, however, is that the classification was not just a reflection of the family's unique condition, it was an attempt to control the narrative, to shape the future of a bloodline that was seen as a threat. As the years passed, the ledger entry became buried deeper in the archives, its meaning fading from memory. The family, once a subject of scientific interest, became nothing more than a footnote in a forgotten ledger. But the implications of that classification lingered far longer. It wasn't just the family who was erased from history. It was a time when the genetic undesirables were separated from society, their lives catalogued in ways that would forever define them. What the family represented, what they became in the eyes of those who classified them, was a tragic reminder of the dangers of genetic determinism and the terrifying consequences of a society that seeks to control its people based on arbitrary genetic criteria. The government's interest in the family did not end with their classification. For years, the records were quietly maintained, studied, and perhaps even used to inform policy. But the family itself, shrouded in secrecy, their lives hidden from public view, would remain a footnote in a government ledger. And while the true reasons for their classification may never be fully understood, the haunting reality of their existence continues to cast a shadow, a reminder of a dark chapter in the history of genetics, eugenics, and the human condition. As the years passed, the family story began to take on the shape of myth, gradually fading into obscurity. The mountain communities that had once whispered about their strange existence slowly began to forget the family altogether. The harsh realities of isolation, the peculiarities of their genetic condition, and the dark whispers that had followed them into the woods were buried under layers of time, becoming little more than a distant echo in the hollows of Appalachia. Yet, despite the passage of decades and the subsequent erasure of their name from public discourse, the legacy of their existence never truly disappeared. It lingered in the faded pages of a government ledger and in the suppressed memories of the few who had encountered them. In many ways, the family's life had been defined by an endless cycle of isolation, fear, and rejection. Even the smallest interactions with the outside world were tinged with suspicion and distrust. The family had been ostracized, not just for their physical abnormalities, but for the very fact that they were different in a place where difference was often equated with danger. Over time, the family became a ghostly presence in the region, their house hidden deep in the woods, a place where few dared to venture. For all their isolation, though, their lives were far from quiet. Their very existence in the mountains seemed to stir something primal in the people who lived nearby. Fear of the unknown had always existed in these hills, but the family embodied that fear in a way no one could ignore. The strange behaviors exhibited by some of the family members only added to the rumors and tales. Their physical anomalies were often described as grotesque, and their social interactions, when they did happen, seemed detached and awkward. The locals, who prided themselves on their self-sufficiency and hard-won resilience, found it difficult to reconcile their own way of life with the family's. Their behavior, their appearances, and their way of life were simply too alien. For some, this strangeness was a source of fascination. For others, it was something to be feared. But as the family's story drifted further into the past, their isolation seemed to become an impenetrable barrier to any real understanding. No one really knew them, not in the way that communities truly know each other. And without true knowledge, the family remained a set of curiosities, a collection of bizarre facts that were passed along as stories. What was left was an image of a family trapped in their own genetic history, unable to break free from the shadow of inbreeding and physical deformity. Over time, their existence began to take on a tragic tone. No one could say if they were simply unlucky, a product of their circumstances, or if their fate had been sealed long before they were even born. In the face of this enduring isolation, it is perhaps no surprise that the family became the subject of widespread gossip. Locals often talked of the strange occurrences that took place near their home, cattle that mysteriously disappeared, strange lights seen at night, and eerie sounds echoing through the woods. The family, whether they were directly involved or not, became entwined in these strange stories, adding to their already bizarre reputation. It is possible that the mountain people, steeped in superstition and old-world beliefs, began to see them as part of the folklore that permeated every aspect of life in Appalachia. The family became a cipher for the unknown, a canvas on which the region's darkest fears were projected. Yet, despite the shadow that followed them, there was an undeniable sense of resilience within the family. They lived in near-complete isolation, eking out a living off the land. The harshness of the environment forced them to rely on each other in ways that few could understand. They were isolated from the world in ways that many could never imagine, living lives that were dictated by their own needs, their own rules. The family survived in a landscape that was both beautiful and unforgiving. In a sense, their isolation was their defense, a shield that kept the world at bay. But this same shield, which protected them from the eyes of outsiders, also prevented them from ever breaking free from the cycle of suspicion and misunderstanding that had come to define them. It was this isolation that ultimately became the family's greatest burden. As generations passed, the family's connection to the outside world became tenuous at best. The isolation that had once been a refuge, a form of self-preservation, became their prison. Inbreeding, perhaps an unintended consequence of their self-sufficiency, had begun to take its toll. Over time, it became clear that the family's future would be marked by the same tragic patterns that had shaped their past. Physical deformities, mental impairments, and genetic disorders became hallmarks of their existence. These characteristics, passed down from one generation to the next, ensured that the family would always remain a mystery, a group of people defined by their genetic inheritance rather than their individual lives. Despite their difficult circumstances, the family continued to survive in the only way they knew how. They lived in near-complete isolation, avoiding any interactions with the outside world whenever possible. The few visitors who did make their way to the remote mountain cabin described a family that was both strange and self-contained, a group of people who had little to no contact with the larger society. Some of the accounts spoke of a family that seemed to exist in its own world, removed from the normal rules of human interaction. Their interactions were often described as odd, stilted, and disconnected, further reinforcing the idea that they were not quite human in the way that others were. Over time, as the family became more and more reclusive, their connection to the world beyond the mountains began to fade. The memories of those who had encountered them grew distant, and the strange rumors about their genetic makeup were replaced by newer, more pressing stories. Their story, once a subject of fascination and horror, slowly turned into a whisper carried on the wind, fading into the silence of the mountains. But even in this silence, the family's legacy endured. They had been erased from public records, their names sealed away in a ledger that no one had the courage to open. Yet the family's existence could not be fully forgotten. In the remote corners of Appalachia, where the shadows of the past still linger, the memory of the family lives on, a dark and tragic reminder of what happens when isolation, genetics, and fate collide. They were a family whose very existence seemed to defy reason, whose bloodline became the subject of whispers and theories. They were the living embodiment of a question that no one could answer. What happens when people are left to live in isolation, when their genetics begin to unravel in the darkness of the mountains? Even today, the legacy of the family is a haunting one, a story wrapped in mystery, fear, and the tragic consequences of their genetic fate. While the world moved on, the family remained a dark, buried truth, an anomaly whose story was lost in the folds of history. And in the depths of those Appalachian mountains, their memory lingers, waiting to be uncovered, waiting for the world to acknowledge the lives that once existed in the shadows. The legend of the family, though buried deep in the hills of Appalachia, wasn't confined to the memories of those who had encountered them. It was a story that seemed to ripple outwards over the years, echoing through the small towns and isolated homesteads that dotted the mountains. Even as the years passed, their tale lingered in the air, becoming woven into the fabric of local folklore. It wasn't just the family's deformities or the peculiarities of their behavior that captured the imagination. It was the mystery of their survival. How had they endured so long in such a harsh, unforgiving environment? What drove them to remain isolated when the world outside beckoned with modernity and opportunity? For all the curiosity and fear they sparked, they had become an enigma, a symbol of both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. The people who had once shared these mountains with the family had their own reasons for abandoning them to their solitude. Some were driven by the fear of contagion, both literal and cultural. There were those who believed that whatever affliction ran through the family's bloodline was somehow contagious, whether through contact or proximity. The family's bizarre appearance, their apparent lack of social grace, and the rumors that surrounded them gave rise to a deep, unfounded fear. The very idea of interacting with them seemed fraught with danger, as if to even look upon them could somehow bring misfortune. The superstitions that swirled around the family only served to fuel this isolation further. They weren't just an isolated family, they were an anomaly, a living embodiment of something misunderstood, something that didn't quite belong in the world they inhabited. Others, too, had reasons to avoid them. There were whispers of strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena that seemed to follow in the wake of the family's reclusive existence. The odd lights seen late at night in the forest, the animals that would vanish without a trace, and the sounds that echoed through the hollowed landscape. These were all part of the myths that began to form around the family. Some locals began to believe that the family was somehow connected to the paranormal, that their strange appearances were a manifestation of some deeper, darker force at work. These rumors, though grounded in superstition, began to take on a life of their own. And as with most folk tales, the stories grew over time, taking on a more sinister tone. The family, in the eyes of the community, was no longer just a family of oddities. They were something more, a symbol of the unknown, a mystery wrapped in a shroud of fear. Despite this, there were a few who tried to make sense of the family's existence in a more pragmatic light. Some outsiders, especially medical professionals, took a more clinical interest in the family. They sought to understand the strange anomalies, the physical deformities, and the cognitive issues that seemed to plague the family members. Over time, it became clear that their isolation had played a significant role in what appeared to be a generational pattern of inbreeding. What had started as a small, self-sustained family unit had, over generations, become a microcosm of genetic decline. Each successive generation seemed to exhibit more pronounced physical and mental abnormalities. The children born into the family carried the legacy of their ancestors' limited gene pool, and as each generation passed, the effects of that genetic isolation became harder to ignore. Some reports from those few who ventured into the family's domain suggested that the family was aware of their condition, though they had little ability to change their fate. The elderly members, those who had witnessed generations of their bloodline, seemed resigned to their situation. They were aware of the rumors, aware of the fear they inspired in others, yet there seemed to be no escape from the trap they had found themselves in. As the family story became more widely known, both through whispered rumors and official government records, they became the subject of both pity and scorn. They were seen as a curiosity by outsiders, a living case study in the dangers of isolation and inbreeding. Their tragic fate was, in many ways, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when people are cut off from the world, left to survive without the support of a broader community or the opportunity to diversify their genetic lineage. But the family, despite their isolation, managed to persist. There was something hauntingly resilient about them. For all their genetic disorders, their social awkwardness, and the stigma that clung to them, they survived. They built their lives in the most inhospitable of conditions, finding ways to live off the land, to work together, and to endure. The cabin that had once been a place of isolation became their sanctuary, the one place where they could exist apart from the fear and misunderstanding that characterized their interactions with the outside world. Yet, the tragedy of their situation was undeniable. They were a family who had become the sum of their genetic inheritance, each member marked by a combination of traits that could not be escaped. They lived in a world that viewed them as less than human, reduced to their physical and mental abnormalities rather than their humanity. The genetic curse that had been passed down through generations was not just a physical one. It was social, cultural, and emotional. It isolated them not only from the outside world but from each other. They were trapped in a cycle, their fate sealed by a combination of biology, environment, and history. They couldn't escape what they had become, and the world around them refused to understand. As their isolation deepened, the family became even more entrenched in their own reality. They no longer had any desire to venture beyond their cabin. Their world had shrunk to the smallest possible circle, family members who could only rely on each other for companionship and support. To the outside world, they had long been forgotten, but within the walls of their cabin, life continued in its own strange rhythm. The family story could have remained buried in the mountains, lost to time and overshadowed by the rapid changes taking place in the rest of the country. But their inclusion in the government ledger ensured that their legacy would never be completely erased. The ledger, with its cold, clinical notation of their genetic undesirability, had marked them as something to be studied, categorized, and remembered. What was initially an official record became a symbol of the government's intrusion into the personal lives of its citizens, a chilling reminder of the eugenics movement that sought to control human genetics. For this family, their story was no longer just one of isolation and survival. It became part of a larger, darker narrative about the lengths to which society would go to regulate and define what was deemed normal. In the end, their survival in isolation was both a triumph and a tragedy. They had managed to carve out a place for themselves in the harshest of environments, surviving for generations in the shadow of society's judgment. But they had done so at great cost, both to themselves and to their descendants. Their story is a tragic reminder of how isolation, both physical and genetic, can distort the human experience. The family, forgotten by most, continues to live on in the records they left behind, a family trapped in time, lost to the world they once knew. As decades passed, the story of the family gradually became an obscure whisper in the annals of local history. The mountains, ever-changing yet timeless in their vastness, had long since swallowed up most of the traces of their existence. The roads, which once led to their cabin, grew over with underbrush, and the once thriving communities around them dissolved into mere memories. Yet the specter of their genetic legacy remained, a stark reminder of the complexities of isolation, biology, and survival. What remained of the family story, especially within the government records, was cold, impersonal, and haunting. The ledger entry, which had once been a simple notation, grew in significance over time. It became more than just a record of a family deemed undesirable by bureaucratic standards. It transformed into a symbol of a darker history, one rooted in the eugenics movement. The very word undesirable carried a weight of judgment and finality. It was a term that defined the family, reduced them to their biological traits rather than the lives they had lived, the suffering they had endured, and the resilience they had shown. This cold categorization, buried within the depths of government archives, represented something far more sinister than just a label. It was an attempt to erase a family's existence, to strip them of their humanity and reduce them to a genetic anomaly. The family's inclusion in such a ledger wasn't just an isolated event. It was part of a broader movement that sought to catalogue and control human populations. At the time, the idea of controlling heredity and managing genetic traits had gained widespread attention, particularly among those who sought to improve society by eliminating what they considered inferior traits. The movement, which would later evolve into full-fledged eugenics programs, was based on the belief that certain genetic traits were undesirable and that society should actively work to prevent these traits from being passed down to future generations. Families like this one, isolated and struggling with the consequences of inbreeding, were seen as prime examples of the dangers of genetic degeneration. Their story, then, was not just about the family itself but about the larger narrative of how genetics were being used to define and control human lives. For the family, their name in the ledger marked the beginning of a history that was no longer their own. Their lives, once lived in the quiet hills of Appalachia, were now reduced to the impersonal language of medical charts, government documents, and sociological theory. The family's existence was no longer about their struggles, their relationships, or their simple attempt at survival. It was about genetics, bloodlines, and the perceived threat they posed to the broader population. Their isolation, which had once been a matter of choice, became a genetic prison, a place where survival depended on the very traits that were seen as undesirable by the society outside. The government's actions, particularly their interest in the family's genetic makeup, mirrored a larger societal obsession with purity and control. At the time, the notion of genetic purity was gaining ground in various scientific and political circles, and the idea that certain individuals could be improved through selective breeding became a central tenet of the eugenics movement. This movement, which sought to eliminate undesirable genetic traits through sterilization, segregation, and even forced breeding programs, was an extreme manifestation of the desire to control human reproduction. And while the family in Appalachia may have been a small, isolated case, their inclusion in the ledger was a reflection of a much larger societal mindset, a mindset that sought to define what it meant to be human and to eliminate what was seen as deviant or unworthy. But the family's story, though overshadowed by the weight of this categorization, was not solely defined by the government's intrusion. Despite the labels and the judgment, the family persisted. Their lives were not simply defined by genetics or the outside world's perception of them. They continued to exist, carving out an existence in the mountains where they had been born. Their survival was, in many ways, a quiet act of defiance, a refusal to be erased, even as society tried to reduce them to a set of traits on a piece of paper. In this sense, their resilience became their legacy. The family had endured the harshest of environments, the greatest of stigmas, and yet they had lived on, hidden away in the shadows of history, their story left to be uncovered by those willing to search for it. The deeper one looks into the history of the family, the more complex the narrative becomes. The ledger, with its cold categorization, is only one piece of the puzzle. To truly understand their story, one must delve into the world in which they lived, the world of the Appalachian Mountains, a place so isolated that time seemed to stand still. Life in the mountains had always been a matter of survival, and for the family, that survival was intricately tied to their ability to adapt to the land around them. The rugged landscape, with its steep slopes and dense forests, was both a sanctuary and a prison. It kept the family hidden from the world but also trapped them in a cycle of genetic isolation that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The isolation of the Appalachian region, a feature that had once been a source of pride for many, became a trap for the family. They lived in a world where inbreeding was not just a consequence of social rejection, but a necessity for survival. In a place where few outsiders ventured, the family had few choices for marriage partners. Over generations, this lack of genetic diversity took its toll. Physical deformities, mental impairments, and a host of other genetic disorders became more pronounced with each passing generation. The family's fate, in many ways, was sealed by their environment, the land they had chosen to call home. Yet, despite their genetic struggles, the family managed to endure. They did what they had to in order to survive. They relied on one another, and they learned to work the land in ways that allowed them to continue existing, even if their world remained small and isolated. Their survival was not just a matter of genetics, but of willpower and determination. It was a reflection of the human spirit's ability to adapt, to persevere in the face of overwhelming odds. But the world beyond the mountains did not see their struggle in this light. To outsiders, the family was a curiosity, an oddity to be studied and categorized. They were a reflection of the worst fears of a society that believed in the purity of the human race, a race that sought to eliminate anything that didn't fit into its narrow definition of what was normal. In this sense, the family was a casualty of a larger, more insidious movement that sought to control not just reproduction, but identity itself. They became an example of what could happen when society failed to intervene, when genetics were allowed to run their course unchecked, without the supposed guidance of modern science. And yet, even within this tragic framework, the family story remains one of survival. They endured, despite the obstacles placed in their way, despite the fear and stigma that surrounded them. Their legacy, though obscured by time, still speaks to the resilience of those who live in the margins of society. In the remote hollows of Appalachia, where the land had carved out the story of their lives, they persisted. Their place in history may have been defined by the ledger and the cold, clinical eyes of government officials, but their lives were defined by something far deeper, their ability to survive in a world that had long since forgotten them. Even as the family story was relegated to the pages of a forgotten ledger, the echoes of their existence continue to resonate. The ledger may have sealed their fate, but it could never fully erase the memory of their survival, their struggles, and the enduring human spirit that defined them. Their story, though buried in bureaucracy, remains a testament to the complexities of genetics, the dangers of isolation, and the lengths to which people will go to survive against the odds. And in the mountains of Appalachia, where the land itself holds secrets that have yet to be uncovered, the legacy of the family endures, forever part of the dark, untold history of a region shrouded in mystery. The passage of time, like the relentless flow of the mountain streams that cut through the Appalachian valleys, wore down the edges of the family's legacy, but it never fully erased it. Despite their near-total isolation, their story left behind subtle, yet profound marks on the surrounding community and on the larger narrative of genetics and human resilience. While the government's ledger entry remained sealed and largely forgotten, the ripple effect of their existence reverberated in whispers passed down through generations of locals. Over time, the family became less of a subject of direct fear and more a piece of folklore, a warning, a ghost story, and a symbol of the unpredictable consequences of human isolation. The first accounts of the family, as pieced together by locals, paint a picture of them as distant, mysterious figures living on the edge of society. The deeper one delved into the history of the region, the clearer it became that their strange existence was a reflection of a broader trend, a trend of communities in the Appalachian Mountains where isolation, self-sufficiency, and a lack of outside influence led to genetic drift that sometimes resulted in unexpected, and often tragic, consequences. In a place where survival was often a matter of skill and resourcefulness, the survival of the family was ultimately dictated by the genetic legacy they had inherited and passed on to the next generation. In the heart of Appalachia, communities were often shaped by isolation. People tended to marry within their own small groups, and the isolation from the rest of the world was both a blessing and a curse. For the family in question, their isolation meant they were safe from the prying eyes of the larger world, but it also meant their genetic pool grew smaller and smaller. There were no other communities nearby, no external influences to introduce genetic diversity, and the effects of this genetic narrowing began to show after only a few generations. The strange physical and mental anomalies that marked the family became increasingly difficult to ignore. What made the family situation all the more tragic was the lack of understanding of the underlying causes of their issues. While modern science and genetic research might have been able to offer some insights into their condition, in the 19th century, explanations for their oddities were steeped in superstition and misdiagnosis. The common belief in the area was that their condition was a curse or a form of divine punishment, a result of their isolation from society and their unnatural lifestyle. These ideas were not just rooted in ignorance, they were also tied to deep-seated cultural beliefs about purity, sin, and the dangers of deviating from social norms. There were those in the community who, although fearful of the family, still expressed a certain level of pity. They were seen as tragic figures, people born into a cycle that they could not escape, trapped by genetics, circumstance, and the very land they inhabited. The family's experience became a cautionary tale, a living example of what could go wrong when people became too removed from the outside world, when social and genetic connections were severed in the name of self-sufficiency and independence. It was a lesson not just about the dangers of inbreeding, but about the social isolation that can result from fear, prejudice, and a lack of understanding. As the family story became more intertwined with local legends, their strange physical features were exaggerated and mythologized. The more time passed, the less their real story was remembered, and the more they became creatures of the local imagination. Stories circulated about their appearances, their peculiarities, and the strange events that seemed to follow them, rumors of their involvement in paranormal activities, sightings of strange lights in the woods, and whispers of mysterious happenings that no one could explain. Over time, these stories merged with the natural fear that people had of anything or anyone that didn't fit into the world they understood. The family's name became synonymous with strangeness, a shorthand for the bizarre and unexplained. The transformation of the family from real, living people into figures of myth was a process that reflects the broader human tendency to create narratives around the unknown. The family, who had once been seen as a simple, isolated group of people trying to survive, became a symbol for something much darker in the eyes of the community. They were no longer simply victims of their circumstances, but rather part of the eerie, mysterious tapestry of Appalachian folklore. They were a living metaphor for the dangers of genetic isolation, a cautionary tale that warned of the consequences of cutting oneself off from the world. But even in the face of myth, the family remained resilient. The very thing that made them so strange to others, their isolation, also allowed them to endure in ways that no one could have predicted. Despite the genetic disorders, the physical deformities, and the mental health issues that plagued them, they survived. They were able to make a living from the land, building a life that, while harsh and deeply removed from the outside world, was their own. They crafted a world for themselves, one that was determined by their own rules and needs, not by the judgment or expectations of others. Their resilience was both a triumph and a tragedy. While they survived, they did so at great cost. The family story is ultimately a reflection of the deep complexities of human survival. It speaks to the ways in which isolation can shape and reshape individuals and communities. In many ways, the family's life in the mountains was defined not by the social connections they had but by the ones they lacked. They were a people who were, by necessity, forced to rely on themselves and each other. They had no larger community to help them, no outside influence to offer assistance or guidance. Their lives were shaped by their ability to adapt to the harsh conditions they faced. And yet, despite all this, there was a kind of beauty in their survival. It was a life that most would never have chosen for themselves, but it was one that they had to endure. The family was shaped by their environment, and their environment, in turn, was shaped by them. Their existence, though marked by tragedy and isolation, was a testament to the enduring human spirit. They were not just victims of their circumstances, they were survivors, people who lived outside of society's norms and who created their own place in the world. In the grander scheme of history, the family story might seem like a footnote, just another forgotten tale of genetic misfortune, of survival in the face of overwhelming odds. But to those who still remember them, to those who still speak their name in hushed tones around campfires or in the corners of old homes, the family represents something much more. They are a reminder of the dangers of isolation, of the complexity of human genetics, and of the ways in which societal norms can shape the very lives of those who fall outside of them. Their legacy, though obscured by time, is a part of the ongoing conversation about genetics, social isolation, and the human need for connection. The family story is, in the end, a story of tragedy, but it is also one of resilience, a tale of human survival against the odds. It is a reminder of the ways in which our own genetic legacy, shaped by both nature and circumstance, can determine not just the course of our lives but also how we are remembered by those who come after us. The family, isolated and misunderstood as they were, left an indelible mark on the history of Appalachia, a mark that, though faint, will never truly fade away. Their lives, and the lessons they impart, will continue to resonate for generations to come. The haunting narrative of the family in Appalachia, shrouded in both mystery and tragedy, remains a stark reminder of how the intersections of genetics, isolation, and society can shape human lives in ways few could ever imagine. While the world around them evolved, expanding into new technologies, ideologies, and social structures, this family remained ensnared in a time warp of their own making, held in place by the suffocating grip of both their genetics and the judgments cast upon them by society. The ledger that had originally recorded their existence in cold bureaucratic detail was more than a mere document. It was an artifact of a time when people like this family were labeled, studied, and reduced to something less than human. But even as the years marched on and the pages of history turned, their story didn't entirely fade into the annals of forgotten tales. It lived on in the shadows, in whispered conversations, and in the flickering remnants of an untold history. As the decades wore on and the echoes of the family's presence in the mountains began to dissipate, the region itself continued to change. The once secluded Appalachian communities, where survival was a matter of self-sufficiency and isolation, gradually opened to the world. Roads were constructed, businesses sprouted, and outside influences, whether cultural, economic, or scientific, began to infiltrate even the most remote areas. It was during these times of transition that the family story was resurrected, not in the way it had once been feared or whispered about in superstition, but through the lens of modern curiosity. With the rise of genetic science and anthropology, a new generation of researchers began to re-examine the family's history, not just from a historical perspective, but through a scientific one as well. For some, the family saga became a fascinating case study in the effects of genetic isolation. In an age where genetics was slowly beginning to unravel the mysteries of heredity, the family stood as an almost chilling example of how inbreeding could manifest over generations.